The evening was ordinary, just like any other, on the bustling street of a modern city. The cold wind pierced through every crack in the old coats of the passers-by, leaving traces of snow that hadn't melted after the last snowfall. At that moment, Joe, a homeless middle-aged man with dark hair already streaked with grey, stood by a street lamp, rubbing his hands into a large, worn-out jacket. His life was an exile from society. Every day he searched for a place to shelter from the cold, sometimes begging for small change from passers-by, sometimes rummaging through dumpsters for food. His gaze was dark and lost, as if he had lost all faith in the possibility of changing his life. The only thing he kept in high regard was an old, rusty lottery ticket. Why did he still keep it? It was the very same ticket a man had given him a few days ago. He remembered the moment clearly. He had been standing by the coffee machine when a large black car stopped beside him. A man in an expensive suit got out, looking far too well dressed for the place. "Have you ever tried your luck?" he asked, handing Joe the ticket. "What?" Joe didn't understand at first. "It's just a lottery ticket. Why would I want this?" The man smiled and explained, "I'm a billionaire. And for you, this is a chance. Not everyone gets such an opportunity. Just play, and you'll see." With those words, the man got back into his car and drove off, leaving Joe with the lottery ticket in his hand. He almost tossed it, but some invisible force made him keep it. Now, after a few days, standing on the cold street, Joe still held on to the ticket. He had no illusions that it could change his life. But some strange instinct made him believe in it. Something that resembled hope. Meanwhile, a car appeared on the street and stopped nearby. A man in a luxurious suit stepped out. At first, Joe didn't pay him much attention, but as the man approached, he took the ticket and carefully examined it. "Do you play?" he asked, as if it was nothing special. "Not really, why?" Joe responded, looking at him skeptically. "This is your luck. You can't just throw it away," the man said. "We'll see if you bring me luck or not." The man was Brock. A billionaire, owner of several large companies, who had built his life through crises, trials, and betrayals. Brock believed only in himself and his power, and it seemed that he had everything. But in reality, he had long lost the emotional satisfaction from life. Becoming cynical, rich, and cold, he was losing touch with reality. And now, when he saw this man, who seemed so far removed from his world, he felt something strange that made him approach. He looked at the ticket, then at Joe, and said, "You know, we can make it so you change your life. But for that, you need more than just a lottery ticket. I'll give you a chance, but it all depends on you." Brock started setting up his game, unaware that this ticket could become the start of something bigger than he could ever imagine. The next day, Joe woke up in a small hotel room that Brock had booked for him. He still couldn't believe that this moment had become a reality. Brock had offered him money, but Joe had refused. Brock noticed this and said, "You kept this lottery ticket not because you want to become rich. You're looking for something more, and I can give that to you. But you need to be ready." At that moment, Brock still didn't realize that even the smallest intervention could turn everything upside down. And then, when Joe sent the ticket for validation, the result was shocking. Joe had won $100 million. This was only the beginning. What should he do with this vast sum? And would it lead to Brock demanding it all for himself? When Joe received the news that he had won $100 million, his first reaction was complete confusion. He sat on the bed in his hotel room, holding the ticket in his hands as if it were an illusion. What was he supposed to do with this kind of money? How would it change his life? What would everything look like now? Brock, standing by the window, watched Joe with a look that was already familiar to him in his business circles, calm, cold, with the hope that he could control everything. At that moment, he understood that this win was just the beginning of something bigger, and his goal wasn't to help Joe become rich, but to maintain control over the situation. "Don't you feel that all of this might just be temporary luck?" Brock asked, looking at Joe. Joe lifted his gaze and replied, "I don't know. I can't even imagine what to do with this. It's more than I could ever imagine. But I didn't ask for this money. It just came to me. But you can change your entire life. You can have everything. You just have to act fast. Joe looked at the ticket again, but once again he didn't know if he could change his life in one moment. He wasn't ready for such weight, even if the money seemed like an incredible chance. In his world, it was like trying to lift a huge pile of stones, not knowing where to find the strength to lift them. Meanwhile, Brock began to form a plan. As always, he acted based on his cold logic. But this time, he would have to approach it differently. Joe wasn't just a street he could walk down and forget. Joe had become the thread that could turn everything he had into something bigger. Brock began to think about how to turn this situation in his favor, how to use this homeless man as a tool for his own interests. Meanwhile, Joe spent the night in the hotel, contemplating his decision. The next morning, he felt how his life was changing, though he still remained in the dark about his confused emotions. When he went down to the hotel restaurant, Brock was already waiting for him at the table, drinking coffee, looking as if this situation was nothing special to him. "Have you thought about it?" Brock asked, raising his cup. "I still don't understand what's going on. I don't want to become like you. I don't want to just buy everything with money. We don't buy, we own. And there's a difference. You have a chance to change your life now, Joe. I'm not asking you to do it on my terms. But if you don't take this chance, you'll remain just the same as you were. No one's going to help people like you unless you step forward yourself." And so, this moment became a turning point for Joe. Something inside him awakened. Maybe he was an outcast, but what if he had a chance not only to win money but to change who he was? "What exactly do you want from me?" Joe asked, not taking his eyes off Brock. "I want your ticket, Joe. And I want you to become my partner. You have no experience in business, but you can be part of something big. You'll get your share, but I'll run everything. Do you agree?" These words struck Joe hard. He had to make a decision that could change everything. He could give Brock the ticket, leave his life unchanged, and get some share of the money, but should he risk it all? Did he have the right to trust this man? At that moment, Brock realized that Joe was no longer the man he had been a few days ago. He needed more than just being another puppet in a big game. Brock knew he could manipulate him, but Joe had something in him that didn't allow him to completely submit. Maybe he wasn't ready for wealth, but he wasn't ready to become part of someone else's game. The next few weeks became a real test for Joe. He received the money, but Brock tried to impose his vision, pulling him into projects and business deals that Joe wasn't interested in. Slowly, Joe realized that the millions he had won felt more like a bitter trap than a great fortune. One evening, during one of these business meetings, Joe finally decided to end his participation in Brock's game. He gathered his things and headed out into the night city. His goal wasn't to escape the money, but to find his true purpose, not letting any billionaire or anyone else define his path. But Brock wasn't ready to let Joe go that easily. He decided that even if he didn't get the money, he had to protect his benefit. He wouldn't allow Joe to leave the game without consequences. Joe couldn't sleep. Sitting on the bed at night, he twisted the lottery ticket in his hands. His thoughts were swirling like a storm, tearing at his mind. This was the moment that would change his life, but how? What would he do with this endless amount of money? How should he live from here on? What was worth fighting for? He recalled his past, the ruthless streets where he fought for every coin. And now he had $100 million. What would he have to give up to become part of a world he had never dared to approach before? But the thought of Brock was always there in his head, reminding him that he had to make a decision. All these reflections were just distractions from the real choice. Brock was on his phone, on the screen of his smartphone. Eventually, Joe decided to call him. His hand trembled as he pressed the call button. The phone's sound was interrupted after a few seconds. "Hello, Joe." Brock's voice sounded calm, but there was something else in it. Joe felt coldness in his words. A hidden message that couldn't leave him indifferent. "Brock, I don't know what to do with this. You want me to give you the ticket, right?" Joe's voice was faint, but each word carried more weight than he realized. "You have a choice, Joe. And I know you understand that this is more than just a win. You can follow the path I've prepared for you, or you can leave it all and return to the life you had before. But you know that no other option will be as profitable for you." He held his breath. Something in Brock's voice made him doubt. It wasn't just about the money, not just about how his situation had changed. Brock was trying to manipulate him, selling him the illusion that he could change something, but only if he followed Brock's way. "I'm not ready to be your puppet," Joe finally answered, though his voice seemed even more confused. He wasn't sure if he could truly let go of the illusion of wealth. Brock laughed, and the laughter was cold and merciless. "You may not be a puppet, but what will you do with all this money? Will you just keep it in a bank account and watch it sit there while you end up on the street again, Joe?" His words struck Joe. He couldn't take his eyes off the ticket in his hands. How could Brock speak so calmly about money, about its meaning, as if it were his natural state? "I don't know why this is so important to you." "Why is it so important to me?" Joe asked, beginning to lose control of the situation. He could feel how with each word, Brock was taking more control over his mind. "Because, Joe, you're the one I've been looking for. You're what I've been missing. And this ticket, this sum, they are all part of the bigger game. But if you're not ready, I'll take it from you." In these moments, Joe felt the weight of decisions crashing down on him. He didn't know if he could make it through all of this. This was the moment when everything could change. He didn't want to lose himself in this world where money meant everything. Meanwhile, Brock decided to shift to another strategy. He sent Joe to meet with people who were supposed to help him organize his new life. For Brock, this was all just part of a bigger game he was playing within his own value system, where everyone was just a piece on the chessboard. A few days later, Joe found himself in an opulent office located on the 50th floor of a skyscraper. The walls were decorated with expensive paintings and the windows offered a magnificent view of the city. Here, among those managing financial flows, Joe felt even more alien than he had on the streets. In this world, there was no place for him. But this was a chance, and he knew it was a chance he couldn't afford to miss. "Are you ready for change?" Joe asked one of Brock's partners. His face showed no emotion, and his eyes were cold and unfriendly. "Yes, I'm ready," Joe said, though there was an internal struggle in his voice. He wasn't sure if he was ready to change his life so drastically, if he was ready to leave behind everything that had once mattered to him. But with each step, Brock was there, and he didn't let Joe stop. Brock was in his head, and now Joe began to understand that everything he had achieved was just part of a bigger trap. With each new step, Joe was drawn deeper into this game, feeling like he was losing control over who he was and what he was doing. His life had become a game he couldn't win. Meanwhile, Brock began manipulating the situation to take the entire sum of money for himself. To him, this seemed fair, as he was the one who had given Joe a chance, and now that chance had to bring him something more. But when Joe learned that Brock was preparing to take the money without his consent, he decided to confront him. Joe was ready to do whatever it took to preserve his freedom, but now he had to decide whether it was worth walking away from the deal or fighting for his right to that money. Would Joe be able to exit this game, leaving Brock behind? Would he realize that true freedom isn't just in money, but in the ability to make decisions for himself? Joe stood by the window on the 50th floor, gazing at the city that seemed completely different to him now. He had once lived among those who had nothing to lose. Now he had everything, money, opportunities, but still felt empty. Was it worth it? And could he get his life back on track after everything that had happened? "You won," Brock's voice echoed again in his mind, like a whisper from the past. Joe was ready to respond, and it wasn't the answer Brock had been expecting. He had come to realize that the only thing that truly mattered to him now was his freedom, his own decisions. Everything he had was given to him by Brock, but now Joe was learning how to take it back. A few days later, Brock reached out, telling him how important it was to unite forces to optimize his winnings. Joe, however, saw these proposals as nothing but manipulation. Brock tried to convince him that in order to keep the money, they needed a friendship. But Joe was no longer willing to listen to these suggestions. "You can't take everything, Brock," Joe said, standing in the doorway of his room, taking a deep breath. His resolve was firm and he felt stronger than ever. "And you think it's just your money?" Brock retorted, a shadow of anger in his voice. "Don't you understand that I helped you become who you are now? I became who I am now because of my own decisions, not your manipulation," Joe continued, unwavering. He held his life in his hands and he was no longer ready to let it be shaped by someone else's desires. Brock looked at him with contempt, but Joe saw only weakness in his gaze. He realized that this billionaire had no power without the ability to control others. And now Joe was ready to turn his back on him. A few days later, Joe made his final decision. He didn't give Brock the money, didn't succumb to his pressure. Instead, he turned to legal advisors to formally secure the winnings for himself, starting a new chapter in his life. He opened a foundation to support the homeless, investing part of his winnings to improve the living conditions of those who, like him once, had nothing. He helped create jobs for people who had the potential but no access to opportunities. Brock tried to turn the situation in his favor, offering him support in business. He tried to manipulate again, but Joe was ready. He was no longer the homeless guy who could be tricked by a large sum of money. He was self-sufficient and unafraid to stand up for himself. Soon, the trial took place. Brock tried to take a portion of the winnings through his contribution to support Joe. But the court ruled that the money belonged to Joe. He won not only in court but in life. And although his struggle was tough, it had changed him. Joe realized that true freedom was not just money but the ability to choose who you are and the path you take. In the final days, Brock gradually left his life. He continued his game, but Joe was no longer a part of it. He had learned that the greatest value was not wealth but the ability to control your own life. Otherwise, in a world where money is omnipotent, it simply dissolves people. "You decided," Joe said to himself, standing in front of his new home, looking at the horizons of the city, which now seemed completely different. His decision turned out to be not just financial. It was a decision about who he wanted to be. And with each step he took in his new life, he felt that his path was the right one. He was no longer a slave to money. He had become himself. Epilogue: a few years later, Joe was already a well-known entrepreneur, the founder of an organization that helped the homeless and worked on improving living conditions in the city. He often thought of Brock, but not with hatred. He simply understood that there are different ways to view the world. And although Brock remained in the shadow of his life, he no longer had the power to control him. Now Joe knew true wealth is not in money. It can buy a lot, but it cannot give you peace of mind. And that peace was the greatest achievement Joe had gained. He was free.